Hi and welcome to this SIAM series where I'm going through the IT management approaches, methodologies, activities and practices, and I'll be giving you the main headline points and the base foundation you need to know about. I'll also be discussing some of my real world application of these activities and practices in various organisations I've worked in. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, like the video and click the bell to get those updates. Okay, so let's get to it. Today I'm going to be covering off the key concept in SIAM, that's Service Integration and Management, around structure types and specifically around the lead supplier sourced service integrator. When I talk about structures, I'm talking about SIAM structures here. Things like governance, things like boards, things like organization, contracts, management and license structures. I will be talking about those on subsequent videos. Okay, quick refresh in terms of the structures. There's four structures. You've got the externally sourced integrator, you've got the internally sourced integrator, and you've got the hybrid service integrator. There are videos on this channel that talk about those. Please do check those out. This video is about the lead supplier as a service integrator. So when we think about structural elements here, for example, when we think about the ecosystem in terms of the customer and the service integrator and the service provider, you would have boards and forums and working groups spread over that ecosystem. We're specifically talking about a lead supplier model here, and I'll discuss those considerations in a few seconds. So what is a lead supplier in terms of the SIAM structure? In a nutshell, it's where you have a service provider and a service integrator are one of the same. So there's three ways typically this would happen. So the role of the service integrator, so the SI, is taken by an external organization, but they also happen to be a service provider. So if we think through the ecosystem, you have the customer at the top, then you've got the service integrator, then you've got a whole collection of service providers, and those can be internal service providers or they can be external service providers. So this can happen where if we say, for the sake of argument, an RFI or an RFP has gone out from the customer and an existing service provider bids and they get the piece of work. So perhaps that's a procurement activity. They've gone through an RFI and RFP. They're an existing service provider providing services to the customer, and they've bid on it and they've now got it. It could also be exactly the same, but it could be the service integrator. So perhaps a service integrator already has a relationship with the customer, or perhaps they don't have a relationship with the customer. Either way, the service integrator bids to be a service provider. So there'd be an external service provider in the ecosystem. And again, that could well have been through an RFI or a RFP process. One external organization, for example, could win two parts of a tender, and that way they effectively become the service integrator as well as the service provider. So if we think through the ecosystem here in terms of customer at the top, service integrator and service providers at the bottom, let's just talk about terminology. Let's talk about contractual relationships for a second. So an organization that is a service provider, so in that ecosystem, service providers are at the level 3, and the service integrator is referred to as a lead supplier. So it's sometimes also called you may well hear the word guardian or custodian, those kind of terms mentioned as well. But it's worth emphasizing here that, as with the other models, that there's no contractual relationship with the service provider. So the service integrator is there to collaborate, to provide that end-to-end integration piece with all of those service providers, internal service providers and external service providers. But even in the lead supplier model, the the service integrator, that actually is also a service provider as well, there's no contractual relationship there, and the emphasis is very much on the customer making sure that all the service providers respect the lead supplier. And you can probably see that there may well be some challenges there. And again, I speak from experience here that there perhaps is sometimes a little bit of friction there in this particular approach. The lead, the other word that you should be aware of is prime vendor. So the lead supplier, when we talk about the service integrator and service provider, this lead supplier structure, it's different than the term prime, and you may well have heard that recently or historically, but where a service provider subcontracts other service providers to deliver whatever service that's providing to the customer. So there's a difference there in terms of how that operates. But any of the service providers in the four structures that we've spoken about, so the external, the internal, the hybrid, and now we're talking about the lead supplier, they can be a prime vendor. So they effectively would subcontract some of their services out in order to deliver the service to the customer. In the SIAM ecosystem, you don't see these contracts. They're called subcontracts. That you don't see them. The SIAM ecosystem is relationships and collaborative behavior between service providers, the service integrator, and then the customer at the top. But they are there. You don't always see them, but it's just worth being aware of that difference. So if you think about the ecosystem here in terms of lead supplier, so you have your customer organization at the top with retained capabilities that may be governance, it may be strategy, it might be risk, it might be enterprise architecture, but you have the customer organization at the top, and then you have the external service integrator in the middle. And then you have your service providers, which typically is a collection of internal service providers, so like application teams perhaps, or development teams, or whatever the internal services are. But you've also got external service providers. Now, the one difference here, of course, one of those external service providers is also the service integrator. So just to recap, you've got the customer at the top, you've got your external service integrator, and then you've got your service providers at the bottom. One of those service providers is also the service integrator. So you have a dotted line there going in. What would be the situation where a customer would use this type of approach? So very similar to the reasoning as to why a customer would go for an external arrangement. So perhaps the customer doesn't necessarily have those capabilities, or maybe they don't want those capabilities, or they don't want the resourcing. Maybe they don't want to go out and recruit new people. They're quite happy using an external third party to do that and to manage that. Or perhaps they don't, not only do they not want to go out and recruit them, they don't want the overhead of then managing them, maintaining them, keeping them up to date, so on and so forth. So very similar to the external situation where the customer just doesn't want or doesn't have those capabilities, or there's no desire to have them and maintain them long term. Typically, a customer will go out to tender with an RFI and then an RFP, and perhaps one of the existing service providers may think, yeah, we're going to bid for that. We have that knowledge already of the customer. We work with them. We have a contract with them at the moment, and we provide whatever service it is. The benefit there, of course, is the customer already knows that service provider. Now, assuming they do a good job, that's clearly a benefit to them in terms of being able to say, well, they're a known quantity. We know service provider X, they've been providing X service to us for the X system for X number of years, perhaps. So there's clearly a benefit there. It's really important to challenge that, and actually the role of service provider is different and needs different skills than service integrator. So the question I always like to ask is, okay, service provider, you've bid for this service integration piece. What skills do you have in this area? What capability do you have here? Or are you just bidding for it because you know it's available and you know us? So it's definitely worth being aware of that. It's also, and it can get quite interesting, where if a supplier, so if a service provider is already supplying a service of some kind to you as a customer, they may also realise, well, you've got other service providers in the mix here. We can provide those services as well, or maybe even some of those internal service providers, we can provide that as well. So there's certainly some advantages there to be thinking through. If an organisation has two hats on, so it's the service integrator and it's the service provider, you do need to be quite careful in the way that this is portrayed and managed and dealt with. You have to be certain there's no unfair advantage for the service integrator or the service provider. It needs to be impartial. It's really important that you have that impartiality there, that there's a tendency that with the service integrator and with the service provider, so somebody could look at it externally and go, well, are they really impartial, or do they have a vested interest in something? It's just a question to consider. Certainly, maybe if you're in a regulated environment, for example, the segregation of duties. I've worked in a number of financial institutes where there needs to be this segregation of duties, and I've certainly gone through a number of internal audits and external audits where that question's been asked: is that service provider genuinely impartial, or is there information going between the service integrator and the service provider? The other thing just to be aware of, and we'll talk about pros and cons later, but I've certainly seen a situation where there's a danger of the customer can be charged twice for the same abilities. So the abilities of the service provider and of the service integrator. So it's certainly one just to watch out. So if we summarise, why would a company use a lead supplier arrangement? Well, first off, there's the trust element. So perhaps that service provider is already providing services to the customer, and on the assumption that the customers are happy that the service provider is doing a good job, and if that service provider has that capability of service integration, you need to ask that question. But if they do have that capability, that fits quite nicely. Likewise, if you have a service integrator that has that service provider capability, again, you need to ask those questions, but it sits quite well in that situation as well. So you would want to be in a situation, if you were a customer, you'd need to be prepared to let go a little here in terms of that another organisation is going to be in the mix here, but perhaps it's the same organisation you're already dealing with in the service provider sense, but you need, as a customer, you need to kind of let go a little, if you like, in terms of letting the service integrator do exactly that, integrate all of those service providers. You may well have been doing that yourself, so perhaps that can be a little challenge. And then, as with the external model, why would you go down the lead supplier model? Well, as a customer, maybe you want SIAM, but you don't have the capabilities, you don't have the people, you don't have the resourcing level that will allow you to put into place an integration function. Now, not only that, it's not just going out and getting people, it's also the investment of keeping that going, and the development and the management and the maintenance of those assets. So that's typically why somebody would go for a lead supplier arrangement. If we now just quickly go through the advantages and disadvantages, and we've covered some of those already, but clearly it's a known entity. So an advantage, if you're already dealing with a supplier and they're bidding for the service integration work, you know them. Likewise, if you've got a service integrator and they're bidding for some service provider work, it's a known entity. Now, clearly that's either going to work well or that's not going to work well, depending on if they're doing a good job or not. But either way, it's an advantage that you already know them. You already have a relationship with them, and not only does that bring the trust element and the capability element, it also brings about there's a speed element there. They already know you, either in a service integrator sense or a service provider sense. So they already know you as a customer. So getting it going, getting it off the ground is likely to be much quicker. And again, it depends on, is the service that they're providing for you as a customer good at the moment, and is it a good relationship? Clearly, if it's not, that's not going to be very productive. There's also an element of, there's a vested interest. So from a customer perspective, the service integrator has this vested interest. So if something goes wrong, it's kind of within their world to fix it. And particularly if you've got service credits or fines or penalties or service outage credits, whatever they are, that you've got that extra incentive that, okay, well, you can't, if you're the service integrator or you're the service provider and you're one of the same, you can't say, oh, it's over here or the problem's over there. You are responsible. The buck is kind of stopping with you either way. Disadvantages, finally. So clearly, if an organisation is acting as both the SI and the SP, so service integrator and service provider, do they have good governance? It's definitely a question you need to ask. So how do you make sure those lines are drawn? How do you make those walls exist between the service integrator and the service provider? I can tell you that's quite difficult. Likewise, the perception that the service integrator and the service provider, there might be an unfair advantage. Maybe they're biased. So it's kind of difficult to be able to demonstrate that. It is absolutely possible, of course it is, but that's clearly something that needs some effort and some thought about. And also the charging, I mentioned it earlier. There is a con there, if you like, that there's you as a customer, you absolutely have to make sure you're not being charged twice for the same thing. So for example, resourcing. So think service desk resources would be a good area that I would certainly want to be looking at. That you may have different roles. You may have a service provider role and a service integrator role. It may be the same person, but you're being charged for two elements of that. Okay, that's it. So please do subscribe, please like the video, and I'll continue to post more information around SIAM.